What's up, guys and girls? It's Vision. Welcome to the Echo Rusher Runemaster guide. So this build, I created it with the idea in mind that I want to get through echoes as quickly as possible in Monolith. And so to do that, this build revolves around the movement skill Flame Rush, and we're using Flame Rush to drop Glyph of Dominion, which is leaving large lightning fields wherever we go. This build is trying to get cooldown wherever we can. We're doing that mostly through stacking intelligence and using the Runemaster passive that gives you 1% CDR per 4 intelligence. And the benefit of using all that intelligence too is we also get a lot of ward retention, which makes this build pretty tanky, with the ward in conjunction with near permanent flame ward by running through our frost wall. And then also all of the damage reduction you get while you're flame rushing, you get minus 18% damage taken, and this is doubled with dots. And so basically you're running through echoes, you're always in your flame rush, you always have your flame ward pretty much, and you just leave a trail of dead enemies behind you as they run through this Glyph of Dominion. And so the Glyph of Dominion, it does more damage the longer it stays, but for normal echo mobs, you're not going to need to worry about that. Some of the common enemies you'll find will die pretty quickly in this field. This helps a little bit more on single target, which this build is about an average boss killer. You're going to have to do mechanics. You won't straight blow up a boss, but I think that's a good trade-off for the speed that this can clear monoliths with. This is a super comfy build to play. You don't need any uniques to make this work. You can start with a level 1 character and level this through, and if you're missing out on a certain unique, you're going to be okay. You can still play it. Alright, so we can look at the skills and I'll explain how this is working. Your primary rotation is going to be Glyph of Dominion and Flame Rush. We'll start with Glyph of Dominion, and I can tell you the ins and outs of that and how this is working to do damage in the build. Basically, with Glyph of Dominion, it's getting dropped by Flame Rush, and it's doing lightning damage over time. We're taking all of the more damage nodes we can find that don't decrease the duration that it stays out. Basically because every second that Glyph of Dominion stays on the ground, it does 36% more damage. And so we're extending that. One thing to note with the Glyph of Dominion, you can take this node for the 10% more damage. It gives it a cooldown, but Flame Rush ignores the cooldown. So this should have a 20-second cooldown on it. But whatever your Flame Rush cooldown is, that's your new Glyph of Dominion cooldown. So you can only have one Glyph of Dominion out at a time. That's okay though. I experimented with using 2 glyphs, but that feels more for a build that focuses on the end explosion of Glyph of Dominion. It feels like way more damage just having the one field. It feels a lot more comfy. And so Glyph of Dominion, we're taking all of this damage over time stuff. We take less expansion speed here, but it gives more duration. This helps out with the single target. So basically when you're fighting a single target, you're not going to want to be flame rushing around constantly. That's why I say you'll have to do mechanics. You're going to want your Glyph of Dominion to stay out and cook for a bit, and that's going to sit under the single target enemy while you're doing other things. I'll get a bit more into the single target rotation in a second. Flame Rush, we're taking all the damage reduction stuff here. When you're leveling this build, you're going to want to rush to drop the Glyph of Dominion first. This will use the unspec'd tree while you're leveling in campaign until you get Glyph of Dominion unlocked. Since that's a little bit later into the tree, it takes you a little while to get there. But this is a nice little extra damage boost while you're leveling in campaign. So you rush this, and then you're taking the reduced damage over time, reduce cooldown wherever you can get it for Flame Rush. That just makes it so you can do it more often and always be progressing forward in a map. You Flame Rush, wait a couple seconds. It can get down below 2 seconds with some investment in cooldown recovery and intelligence, but ideally your Flame Rush, Flame Rush, Flame Rush. Things are getting caught in the glyph behind you and dying. We convert the Flame Rush to lightning. Everything in this build is converted to lightning, and I'll explain why later. It has to do with our single target. We take a couple points of frenzy here. This helps with the Runic bolt, which we're going to be using for debuff application and mana regeneration. And then you'll want the 5 Fire Shred stacks on pass through with Flame Rush. We're going to be using the Lightning Shred Blessing This makes it so you're guaranteed to pretty much always have the 10 stacks of lightning shred on enemies. So that's the flame rush tree. Since we're scaling lightning damage over time, another way to get lightning damage over time is with Frost Wall, which is also converted to lightning. In addition to being an extra source of damage, it's also giving us some utility. Like I said, we're stacking intelligence, so we're going to have a lot of ward retention. There's ways to get ward here, like ward gained when an enemy passes through your wall. So there's ward here when an enemy passes through the wall based on their max health. There's some stuff down here I'm taking for just to buff up Frost Wall's damage a little bit more. 15% more damage over time taken per second for as long, like, as the wall lasts. So it deals more damage the same way Glyph of Dominion does. So on a single target, you're letting your glyph sit on the target, you're letting your Frost Wall sit on the target. And then the extra bonus of Frost Wall is you can get Flame Ward when you pass through it. So we take this here. This gives you some mana if your Frost Wall's far away. That helps a little bit with mana sustain, but it's not game changing. It feels nice. It makes the build feel a little bit more comfy as far as mana management goes. You get Haste and Frenzy. This is for any allies that pass through the wall. And then Flame Ward. So here, Flame Ward has an additional 250% mana cost. But Flame Ward is really not that expensive. It's 12 mana, so you can walk through this and you're not going to take a big chunk out of your mana. And there's a little trick you can do where you use your Frost Wall. So in the tooltip, it should only be able to apply Frost Wall once, but what you can do is you walk through your Frost Wall, you get your Flame Ward. If you move your Frost Wall, you can walk through it again and get your Flame Ward additional times. And so we're doing that with this node all the way in the bottom right that lets you reposition your wall. Frost Wall moves. And you can do this for allies too if you're playing in a party. It's pretty spicy. Yeah, you drop your Frost Wall, run through, Flame Ward, you move the wall, more Flame Ward. And that's what I mean by having pretty much constant Flame Ward. You can run Flame Ward charges on your chest, 2+1, and you'll just never run out. You're just always going to have Flame Ward. And so let's talk about Flame Ward while I'm going on and on about it. Flame Ward, obviously, really great because you get a big chunk of ward. We'll run multiple charges here at the top, but you also get 40% less hit damage and minus 10% elemental damage taken here. Traditionally, people will run 3 out of 3 in this and go all in on the Flame Rush damage reduction, but I've got it giving 250% increased damage. This is converted to lightning with this node. I wanted to have Flame Ward as lightning anyway, just so it doesn't mess with our rune combos. So that's a nice... you always have that 250% increased damage, and that's going to help with scaling your Glyph of Dominion and Frost Wall damage. Yeah, and you can see too, it's not super taxing on the mana bar. So that's all that. For the most part, you don't have mana trouble with this build unless you're just constantly on the move through Monolith and Echo. Even then, you can make it to your objective before you're mana drained. But in the cases that you are mana drained, Runic Bolt is helping with that. You have a 100% chance to gain mana with Runic Bolt. The rest of that kind of just supports, the rest of this tree kind of just supports that. We have some extra projectiles here. Really, we're just coming up to the auto targeting, and that makes it so you hit enemies more reliably. Runic Bolt travels kind of slow, and the projectile's a little thin, so in the chaos of an Echo, it might be a little hard to hit enemies. The auto target just helps with that. We take chance for double cast here because why not? You might get a chance to get extra mana back if you double cast it. And then in the Runic Bolt tree, we're taking the 2 nodes that swap your Fire Bolt to Lightning and your Cold Bolt to Lightning. And this makes it so you always have 3 lightning glyphs. This is important for single target because we're going to be using, it's called Ball Lightning. We put this out and it does 4 hits per 4 seconds. So over the duration of your Ball Lightning, it's going to be hitting a target 16 times. And this is what helps us apply debuffs to a single target. It also does a little bit of damage too. We're scaling. We've got like the lightning shred. We were going to have shock, and so that will do some damage too to support killing a boss. Ideal ailments that this is applying: lightning shred from blessing, shock, armor shred, and I'll explain why we use armor shred with a DoT build. Frailty, yes, chain light. The ball lightning is going to be your debuff applicator. So why we're running armor shred, Glyph of Dominion does up to 14% more damage, so you get 1 stack per armor shred. You don't need a lot of armor shred in this build, just enough to reliably hit your 14. But the ball lightning's not alone. Like, you're also doing hits with your flame rush, you're doing hits with your runic bolt. And so what the single target on a boss would be for this, you drop your frost wall so it's sitting on top of the enemy. You want to try to drop your Glyph of Dominion. You can also go through your frost wall to get the increased damage. And so we have these 2 things cooking on the target, and then you drop your Runic Invocation, and that's applying hits and debuffs, and also your Runic Bolt's applying debuffs. So if you're having a hard time getting armor shred too, I run armor shred on the Runic Bolt tree, and that will just help you get your stacks. Like if you're having a, like with this build, for this character for example, I had a really hard time getting armor shred on my gear, so this is just supporting that. And this character in general, my gear is in a transitional phase. It's a little rough, so I think this build can scale a lot harder than it looks now, just because I'm missing elemental damage over time on all of the key pieces. No elemental damage over time on amulet, no elemental damage over time on rings. My belt's got it. I just swapped out for Twisted Heart, so I could have it there in my relic slot, but this makes me a little bit more tanky. You can see like in some of the monolith and boss clips just how much ward I've got with Twisted Heart. That's one option for this build. And so yeah, that's your, I'll go quickly over the AoE rotation and your boss rotation one more time. So single target, or AoE, just traveling through echoes. You drop your frost wall in front of you, and it's pretty fun. You try to just flame rush through that for the flame ward buff, and you just keep moving. That stuff behind you is gonna die. You can keep an eye on your mini map for like uniques. You can kind of keep an eye out behind you too if you want to go a little bit slower, just so you can watch for drops, like exalteds and that kind of thing. But really, this is just good at quickly progressing echoes, and then you're tanky while you're doing it. If you ever get hung up on a tanky rare enemy, you can always just do your single target here. And as you need to do that, you can Runic Bolt for mana. And this is what the single target will look like. If you're fighting something like a Shade, you want to get your Glyph of Dominion out already, stacking up the damage. Same with the Frost Wall, so when he spawns, it's already doing a lot of damage. And you're basically just doing this, doing mechanics. It's not like super intensive to do in a fight. You're basically focusing on mechanics while your dots are doing damage. And you can see you're not going to be like extremely mana hungry, so you don't have to worry too much about running out of mana and not being able to do your thing. So that's AoE and single target rotation. And I guess I should mention that you don't need the Glyph of Dominion on your bar, as you can see, and that's what allows us to have an unspec'd Runic Invocation there. All right, so I'll quickly go over passives too and show you guys kind of how this is all working. We want to get as much intelligence as we can, so we're trying to take that wherever we can efficiently. So we have intelligence here. Here I went for the cast speed and attack speed. There's not the cast speed helps with the Runic Bolt. That's really the only benefit from this. Really, we're just trying to get to 20. The rest of our points go into health and mana. We don't need any of this other stuff like crit, for example. And the mana helps us hit our 300 mana cap, which we need for idols, which I'll show. That's the base mage tree. We take 6 points in Spellblade at some point when it feels comfortable for you to do that. Like when your power level feels pretty good and your resistances need a little love, you can take 6 points here for 18% elemental resistance. All right, Runemaster, we take less damage taken from ignited, shocked, or chilled enemies. You should be able to get shocked pretty reliably, especially if you're running these nodes in Glyph of Dominion to get shock chance for you and your allies that are standing in the glyph. If you don't have those points yet, you can try to work it into a weapon. This build has a lot of ways that it can find shock, so we're taking that for the less damage. We focus a lot on this section here. There's a lot of mana burst. Every time when you use a 0-cost mana skill like Runic Bolt, every 3 cast you get an extra 15 mana and ward, and that helps your Runic Bolt also, your Runebolt, sustain your mana because you're getting mana burst and you're getting the mana back from casting it. You get intelligence here, ward gained on direct spell cast. We're basically just traveling up here to ward per second, and an additional 24 ward per second with 60 intelligence. This is kind of just padding out our ward. It's going to make you a little bit extra tanky. It feels really nice. The ward in this build feels really nice. Extra area for area skills. Ward per rune on area skill use. So we always have 3 runes up unless we're fighting a single target. And even when we use our runes, we get them back very quickly. And since all of our stuff is area for the most part, Frostwall's area, Runic Invocation's area are the one we use. Flame Rush's area, Glyph of Dominion's area. Each of these skills, when we use them, is giving us ward. So we just always have a nice income of ward. More flat spell damage here. We don't need the crit, but the flat spell damage feels nice for scaling our dots. 5 out of 5 here on ward gained on traversal skill use. That's an extra 100 ward pretty much every 2 seconds or less, depending on how much cooldown you have. And then we're looking up here. There is a third elemental damage over time that we're doing, third lightning damage over time, and that's Brand of Deception. Lightning skills that cost at least 15 mana apply Brand of Deception, and that's doing 400 lightning damage over time over 3 seconds. You also get additional elemental penetration here too, for damage over time. Any penetration you can find is really good because it gives you more damage onto your skills. And all of our Flame Rush is 15 mana, Frostwall's over 15 mana. And so those are going to be applying Brand of Deception, which helps with your damage and also scales with your damage over time. Elemental damage over time that you have on gear. This node gives you 12% more damage to enemies when it's maxed out, and it lets your Brand of Deception do more damage per shock chance. This build is not super shock heavy, but you can get it pretty reliably. It's just because when you're moving through an echo, you're not sitting still and stacking shock the same way that you would be on a single target. But this kicks in more on a single target, the more Brand of Deception damage. I would never trade out like Chill, for example, from a weapon, because you'll be losing the movement speed, attack speed, cast speed reduction on enemies. And so while I was gearing, I found that I didn't super stress the shock, but it's nice to have later in game when your gear's starting to come together. 10 out of 10 here. This node's really important. It gives you 10 intelligence, but more importantly, you get cooldown recovery speed per 4 intelligence. And so you're getting a lot of CDR per that. 8 out of 8 here for the endurance and more flat mana. Endurance is nice because it frees up a little bit of pressure on your gear. You don't have to have endurance on like several different pieces. And the flat mana helps because you're just trying to get above 300. And finally up here, you're putting points into Celestial Doom. That gives more flat damage. Flat damage is always great. And it gives you more spell damage to branded bosses and ward gain versus branded bosses. And you're just always going to have this Brand of Deception up. So that's just free stats there. And that's the passives for this build. All right, let's take a quick look at gearing. I'll go over it slot by slot. Helmet, we're using the cooldown recovery base with increased mana. Obviously, we want cooldown recovery. The increased mana helps get our mana above 300. You want to try to do that as quickly as possible, but not at the cost of sacrificing defense. Like, you'll see that I run mana on some of these. When I was leveling, I was a bit greedy and tended toward taking my mana to tier 5 before defenses, just so I could get the 300. And while we're going for 300 mana, we're getting the increased lightning damage on idle suffixes. We're using Grand and Ornate. That's doubled if you have more than 300 mana, so that's a pretty big boost to your increased damage. But yeah, so on Helmet, we're using the increased mana, cooldown recovery implicit. We've got intelligence there, vitality on the prefixes. This build doesn't really have a lot of class-specific prefixes that are good for it, other than Glyph of Dominion skill points down there. There's like a Flame Rush travel speed and duration, but the way we're playing Flame Rush, it caps it at 1.5 second channel time, and that's basically however far you can get in the 1.5 seconds. That's the distance. It's locked to that. And I didn't feel like I needed to increase that while I was leveling, because your flame rush can always hit the edge of your screen. You need like some super ultra wide monitor for the flame rush speed and duration to feel impactful. And so also on the helmet, we're running flat health, increased health, and you want to try to seal the increased armor there. This build is not going to be super armor heavy, but the percent increased armor does help buff your mitigation by a little bit. Chest, we're using the increased mana regen, implicits. Once again, the mana helps you reach the 300 threshold. And while your mana regen is not a big problem, the increased mana regen does help a little bit to just make the build comfy to play. Intelligence on the prefix and charge for Flame Ward. The charge for Flame Ward is pretty flexible. As you saw, we pretty much always have constant Flame Ward. We're never out of charges with the help of Frostwall. So if you wanted to, you could swap that out for Vitality for more health and poison and necrotic resistance. Suffixes, we're using flat health and increased health with the armor sealed. This build is going to use some of the new experimental affixes. Something to keep in mind with experimental affixes is they are guaranteed to always seal with the rune. And so if you find a tier 5 seconds of traversal skill cooldown recovered on potion use, you can just auto seal that. And it gives you potion find chance too, so that's just some ways to knock the duration, or the duration of the flame rush cooldown down. So we run, most importantly on belt, hybrid health. The cooldown recovery is pretty nice. And then on the prefixes, we're running increased elemental damage and increased lightning damage. Boots, we're doing intelligence and move speed, hybrid health, and cooldown. So for this, since boots are the only place you can get movement speed, try to get those to tier 5. You don't want to run around echoes like a snail. You want to be kind of fast. Also, you want to try to work on getting that hybrid health to tier 5 in all of the slots as soon as you can. In the meantime, while you're farming for shards for those, you can just get flat health in that spot, and that feels pretty good too, until you can scale it a bit later on with the hybrid health. Also, we're using Hyoborian boots specifically because they complement the implicit of your gold amulet. Your lightning and fire res are going to be kind of covered with this, and so the Hyoborian boots work to fill in that gap on your elemental resistances. So for gloves, we're using Crusader gauntlets. That's giving you some of your void res. We're running intelligence on gloves, mana on gloves, hybrid health, and physical res on suffixes, at least to start. Later on, you're going to be getting physical res from your blessing, and then you'll be able to free that spot up for more health or armor shred. For rings, we're doing ivory rings. That gives some ward retention, which we already have a lot from intelligence. Having more ward retention feels pretty good, but more importantly, this covers our necrotic resistance. If you get some decently rolled ivory rings, you don't have to think about necrotic resistance again, because that should be capped. We're doing elemental damage over time and intelligence on rings. The elemental damage over time, it feels really good when you can get that to a tier 5. Obviously, I showed my character didn't quite have it, but it should be a pretty big damage increase just because the roll range on that goes so high. At the beginning, you're going to be running critical strike avoidance and endurance on the rings. Try to get your critical strike avoidance to tier 5. You can run that in both rings. You can run that on both rings until you get your blessing. And with the blessing, that will cap your critical strike avoidance. Something else you can do is there's a mage chest for crit avoidance. And if you have bad luck trying to get your critical strike avoidance blessing when you're just progressing to empowered, you can just run a crit avoidance implicit chest. But later on, you want to get the level 100 version of this. And if that, in conjunction with a high rolled critical strike avoidance suffix on your ring, that will completely cover you. And I feel like at this point I should mention why we're not using the less bonus damage taken from crits with a catalyst. Personally, I experimented a bit with shield and catalyst. And overall, since we're always in the thick of enemies, the shield felt way better for tankiness. And also there's not a lot of catalyst implicits that feel good for us. A lot of it's crit, spell crit, minion damage, the mana regen we don't really need, and so the shield just felt way more comfy here. We're going to be running the iron glass shield because it's got the highest block chance on implicit, and mage has no block support in their tree, so you would just want to get that high block chance to make that more reliable. Your block effectiveness will be a little bit lower, but that's okay. What's more important is with the higher block chance, the mitigations kicking in more often, even if it's a bit lower. So while I'm on shield, we're running block chance on the prefix, block effectiveness on the prefix. That's just going to help support your tankiness when you're a mage using a shield. But we're not going to prioritize that because we're also using shield as a place to dump our missing resistances. So we have void res there, and that with the Crusader gauntlets will cap your void res, and then you don't have to think about that anymore. Poison res on shield, and with the poison res on shield, we're going to be also taking that on idols, and that will cap you or get you very close to cap. Depending on how your rolls are, it will overcap you by just a little bit. So finally, let's look at relic here. Increased damage over time relic is good for us. Later on, you could switch this to a twisted heart if you wanted to. You would be losing out on some things like your plus to Glyph of Dominion and increased elemental damage over time. Important part about this also is that you get your cold res here, so try to take that to a tier 5 first, because tier 5 cold res here with your Heoborian boots having the cold res on the implicit, that caps you the rest of the way. Finally, we're using Scepter. There's a very specific reason why I use Scepter here, and that is for the flat spell lightning damage prefix and lightning damage leech his health. The leech feels really good with this build. You're going to be running the spell leech blessing from Black Sun timeline too, so that is going to give you a ton of health sustain. And then later on, if you switch to a twisted heart, you're going to have so much leech that your health can bounce back up pretty comfortably. The flat damage is obviously very good for your DoT scaling. Also running lightning damage on your prefix. As soon as you can, you want to try to swap into this Scepter and get your 2 spell lightning and increased lightning damage prefixes to tier 5. That's just going to help your damage bump up a bit. There's something very important with this though. We're not using a wand, so we don't have -3 spell mana cost. So it is very important to get this increased spell damage, -3 spell mana cost, because that's going to make your Runebolt 0 mana. I would even say maybe your first Glyph of Despair, use that on put a tier 1 spell damage mana -3 mana cost on there and seal that immediately. That's what I would use my first Glyph of Despair for, just to have that ready. And then your prefixes are open to push the damages up to a tier 5. That's the Scepter. So a quick look at the idols. Grand Idol, we're going to be running increased damage on the prefix, increased lightning damage, doubled over 300 mana. That suffix is going to be on all of our idols here, the long ones. On the ornate idols, we're running increased area for elemental skills. And as you saw earlier, all of our skills are pretty much area, so that just helps a little bit with coverage. If you're running through echoes and you find a big choke points, that's going to help expand it and kind of cover those gaps some. So also vitality prefix on this humble idol with poison res. The poison res on these suffixes, also on the small Terran idols, are going to work with your poison res here on the shield to kind of cap you. And then we just have increased health, flat health, stout Ligonian idol. That's your idols. All right, for blessings, we're going to want to try to get the spell damage leeched his health from Black Sun as soon as we can. This build has ward generation, but you're still always going to want to have a little bit of HP leech too, just to feel comfy. You're not going to have any, like, a lot of health regen. You're not getting health back from skills. And so this offsets that and makes it so your health bar stays consistently full. That combined with the Scepter was very noticeable when I was leveling and pushing this character. And so that felt good. You're going to be running lightning shred resistance on from the Lagon timeline. That just helps increase the damage. You can pretty easily get 10 stacks with this build, especially on a single target. Honestly, even through AoE, since we're getting the 5 lightning shred stacks from Flame Rush, your enemies are going to be pretty consistently shred capped. We're running crit avoidance from Reign of Dragons, physical res from Age of Winter. Without this, the build, all of your suffixes pretty much become resistances, so the armor feels nice from this, but it feels way just smoother to take the physical res here. That frees up spots on your gear for like endurance in the meantime, or flat health. And the end goal is to try to get as much flat health as you can and suffixes eventually. And then we're just running the flat armor from Spirit of Fire. There's nothing else we really need here. And the flat armor is just going to scale a bit with all of the increased armor that we're scaling. or sealing onto our gear, and just the armor you get naturally from gear implicits. So that's the idols and blessings. I'll show you guys kind of what to do later on as you push this build further into endgame. As you work on this character and start getting into echoes and farming bosses and keeping an eye out for gear, I can go through and show you what the most important exalted stats are to look for each piece. Intelligence is this build's best friend because we're getting a lot of ward retention and we're getting a lot of cooldown for intelligence, and it scales our damage. So you're going to want to keep your defenses capped. You want to keep your endurance capped, critical strike avoidance capped, keep your reses capped or as close to cap as possible, and stack health where you can. For the helmet and the chest, you're going to be trying to find exalted intelligence to start with. Obviously, if you can't get that, if you find exalted health, that feels really good too. Exalted increased health. I had a chest piece while I was leveling that had a max roll tier 7 increased health, and as soon as I put that thing on, my health jumped 600, and it feels great to just immediately get that much tankier. So the health is a really good one to find as exalted too. That goes for all the pieces really. If you can find exalted hybrid health, that feels really good. Elemental damage over time is a good one to look out for exalted also. You might notice that I don't have cleanse on my belt too. Most builds, actually all builds, will run a cleanse on belt. That's pretty standard. You'll seal that onto your belt because you only need the tier 1. But in our Glyph of Dominion tree, we always are cleansed when we're in our Glyph of Dominion. And so every time you flame rush, you get cleansed. So that's every 2 seconds or less, depending on cooldown. And so you can pretty much just not have ailments on you constantly. Since we don't have the cleanse also on belt, that makes it so it stays open for this experimental affix here. For boots, like I was saying earlier, this is the only place you can get move speed. So if you can find exalted move speed, that feels really good. Hybrid health would probably be another good high priority there if you can find that exalted. And obviously the cooldown feels pretty good, but you want to look out for the move speed just because this is the only place you can get it. And the whole goal of this build is to be going through monoliths quickly. Gloves, also looking for the exalted hybrid health. If you find exalted mana, that can free up pressure from other places. You don't need high rolls, you don't need tier 5s to be able to break the 300. So an exalted mana here could help relieve some gear pressure. Also, exalted health or intelligence doesn't feel bad either. I will point out here too that on gloves we're running another experimental affix that gives your armor mitigation. It makes your armor mitigation also apply to dots. For relic, you don't really need more than 2 points of Glyph of Dominion. A lot of builds will prioritize the plus to skill levels because you get the extra 2, but an extra 2 from Glyph of Dominion will just go into your shock chance. And you don't really need a super lot of shock chance when you're doing 16 hits plus your flame rush and your rune bolts. So the Glyph of Dominion extra points is not super essential, so you'd probably want to look for health here. You won't need exalted cold res because your boots should cover that with the suffix here. And then same with the gloves. If you get exalted mana, that frees up gear pressure in other places. And so for rings, you're looking for exalted intelligence. Increased damage over time is another good option here. The resistances, crit avoidance, you don't really need an exalted on. A tier 5 should cover it if you get a good enough roll. Same with endurance, you get capped pretty easily with your passive tree and suffixes. If you are going to use a unique with this build, other than Twisted Heart, Aurora's Time Glass is another item that helps quite a bit with defenses. You'll have endurance here on this. You lose out on some stuff. You lose out on your lightning penetration, which reduces your damage a bit, but you just trade that off for being extra tanky. Yeah, and since this has endurance on one of the modifiers, you can lose your endurance suffix from one of your rings. And since you're losing the fire and lightning implicit from Gold Amulet here, you can just put elemental resistance in its place, and you can swap out one of your poison res suffixes here for an elemental res to kind of cover that gap. For Scepter, you want to look for exalted spell lightning damage and lightning damage leech. The leech feels really good. Flat damage is really good for us. The chance to chill and slow, you don't need to worry about those being super high tier. You just need enough to apply the 3 stacks reliably. Really, what you really want here is the flat lightning damage. And if you get the increased lightning damage, that's okay too. But keep an eye out for the spell lightning damage. On shield, you want to keep an eye out for exalted reduced damage taken on block. With the higher rolled crit avoidance blessing, we can lose that from one of our rings. And so losing it on this ring lets us move void res from the shield to the ring. And then we can take reduced damage taken on block, which just helps with your overall reduced damage taken and makes the build tanky, more tanky than it already is. Block chance exalted can be okay. Exalted block effectiveness can be okay. All of those are going to contribute to your Runemaster being more tanky. The exalted poison res, not essential, but could free up other gear pressure and idols, for example, if you needed other reses here to get capped. So that's what a more late game version of this build would look like. You're going to farm better versions of all your blessings. Better spell damage leached, better crit avoidance, flat armor here, get the better version of that. Better physical res, better lightning shred. You're just going to be upgrading all of what you have pretty much. So with this build, let's talk about multiplayer synergy and what kind of group this character would play in. So this build is focused on getting through echoes as quickly as possible. So you probably want to be in a group that can keep up with you. This build with as much damage reduction as it gets and kind of setting up a field. So you're staying pretty much at the front of your group. You drop the Glyph of Dominion. Enemies are dying in your Glyph of Dominion. Any ally that enters Glyph of Dominion, they're having their ailments cleansed thanks to this node. So you're pretty much any negative effect on your ally, as soon as they step in your glyph, that gets cleansed off. You're also getting ward per second. This is for all of your allies too. For every 4% uncapped resistance, your allies are getting an extra one ward. And so that's how your Glyph of Dominion is supporting the team. You stay in the front, you're getting all this damage reduction. Your allies step in, they get cleansed, they're getting ward. Like if you stand here in this location and fight, they're getting ward, they're getting the cleanse, and you're moving on to the next pack. So you're leading the way. Also, your allies are getting benefits from your flame ward here, getting cast by Frostwall. And same thing with them, they get flame ward every time you move the wall. So you drop your flame ward, you're rushing forward, you put it to the next spot. So as you're moving through here, you're dropping Glyph of Dominion, you're dropping your wall. Your allies are getting cleansed, they're getting ward per second. They're getting your flame ward buff and all the damage reduction that goes along with that too. So you're bulking up your allies. If any of your allies are running lightning damage, they're going to really like this increased damage too. And so that is your echo strategy for multiplayer. You're leading the way and applying all these buffs. On single target, you want to play a little bit differently. Here, you're not quite leading the pack. Here, you want to set up your fields on the target. Make sure you're putting your frost wall in a position where allies can easily access it. But you drop your stuff. You kind of retreat back behind your party and put the frost wall in a good location. If your allies are doing more damage than you, then focus your frost wall on buffing them more so than sitting on top of the enemy target. You want to put it in a spot where it's comfortable for your allies to get in and out of the wall for the buffs while they can still do mechanics. And then you'll be sitting in the back using Runebolt to stack debuffs. Also, same with your Invocation. You're going to be debuff stacking. When your glyph falls off and your wall falls off, just go in and reset it. That's how this build is going to play in a party dynamic. You're pretty much going to be tanky, doing some supportive elements with cleanse ailments and the ward per second and the flame ward, and you're going to be applying debuffs. Anyway, guys, I hope you have fun with this build. This build was a lot of fun to play. This is maybe one of my most fun builds that I've played in Last Epoch, just because it's nice to always be moving forward and watching enemies disintegrate in your rune behind you. It also feels very impactful. Just like every gear piece upgrade you get, you can immediately feel it in the build, so it feels satisfying to play and acquire gear with. But yeah, I'm going to have planners down in the description for each stage of the gearing process, what this build looks like starting Monolith, how it'll look on a planner as you start to get more gear and progress a bit, and then finally what it'll look like with all best in slot pieces equipped. If you have any questions, you can always stop by my stream and ask, and I'm happy to explain anything with the build, or always feel free to ask down in the comments. Thank you guys for watching. Good luck with the build. Peace.
Death.